Welcome to Talking Law, a roundup of key current awareness topics from property and environment law over the last month. I'm Jen Hawkins, a planning solicitor supporting the Property and Environment PSL modules, and I'm joined today by Jo Bhatia and Malcolm Dowden, both property law specialists, and Hayley Tam, who's our environment law specialist. So I'd first like to introduce you to Jo Bhatia. Jo's going to be talking about the budget 2012 in relation to the stamp duty land tax. So Jo, have there been any changes to the rates of stamp duty land tax?
Thanks, Jen. Yes, there have. There's a new rate of 7% for residential properties over 2 million with effect from 22nd of March, and with effect from the 21st of March there's a new rate of 15%, again for residential properties over 2 million where they're acquired by non-natural persons, which is essentially corporate entities, with some exceptions, for example property developers.
So 15%, that seems very high.
Yes, it is. The government's made it very clear it intends to stamp down on tax avoidance, where property is acquired by a corporate vehicle. Then the onward sale is achieved by sale of the shares at a stamp duty rate of 0.5% rather than the sale of the property with a much higher charge to SDLT.
So could the company still avoid stamp duty land tax on the onward sale of a share sale?
In theory, yes, but aside from the massive disincentive to the initial acquisition, the government is also going to consult on a couple of other measures it intends to bring in April 2013. The first of these is an annual charge for non-natural persons holding residential property over 2 million, and presumably if that's punitive enough it's going to discourage indirect ownership. And secondly, it's going to tackle tax avoidance through ownership by offshore companies. It's not going to do that through the SDLT regime, but it's going to extend capital gains tax liability to the disposal of UK residential property by non-natural, non-resident persons.
Okay. So are there any other anti-avoidance measures?
Yes, the government's going to stamp down on schemes that abuse the subsale rules. So legislation in the Finance Bill will make it clear that with effect from 21st of March, the grant or assignment of an option does not satisfy the subsale requirements.
Okay, so are any other reliefs affected?
Yes, in terms of reliefs, the government has confirmed that as planned, zero carbon homes relief won't extend beyond 30th of September. Disadvantaged areas relief is not going to be around after April 2013, although it only applies to residential property at the moment since 2005. And finally, just a reminder that from the 25th of March, first-time buyers relief is no longer available.
Okay, thanks Jo. I'm also joined today by Malcolm Dowden, our property law specialist. Malcolm's going to be talking to us about the CRC Energy Efficiency Scheme. So Malcolm, could you briefly describe what CRC is and who might be affected by it?
Yes, CRC is a cap and trade scheme that was authorised by the Climate Change Act in 2008. It affects public sector bodies and also private sector businesses whose energy use crosses a threshold that was set in 2008. And crucially, when you're looking at corporate CRC participants, the scheme applies not just to the parent company, but to every company within that group.
Okay. I've heard CRC described as a stealth tax. Is there any truth in that?
Some would say there's no stealth to the tax element at all. Until October of 2010, the idea was that the money that was paid for allowances to use energy under CRC, was to be returned, recycled to participants. You wouldn't get back necessarily what you paid. The idea was that money would be returned according to a league table. So those who improved their energy performance would receive a greater share of the recycling. That stopped, and the money that was collected is now being diverted into the Treasury. That's essentially what makes it a tax.
Oh, I see. So how was CRC treated in the March 2012 budget?
There's an announcement buried in the budget technical papers suggesting that the government's going to have one more go at simplifying CRC, and that if by autumn 2012 they've failed again to simplify it, that it could be replaced by an out-and-out carbon tax, legislated for in autumn 2012, probably coming into force in April 2013.
So what should people do for the rest of the year?
Well, for the rest of the year, the main practical message is that CRC still applies. It's full of enforcement mechanisms and penalties. So the announcement in the budget must not be taken as license to miss reporting deadlines, to miss the brief window when allowances can be purchased, or to fail to meet any of the other requirements. It's a very significant regime in terms of enforcement. That, I think, is the key point.
Okay, thanks Malcolm. Quite a lot has been going on in the environment field over the last month, coming out of the budget and new environmental regulations. Hayley Tam, our environment law specialist, is going to talk us through some of the key changes. Hayley, the budget referred to the rationalisation of environmental regulation. Could you explain what that means?
Yes, this is a reference to the government's review of environmental regulation as part of the Red Tape Challenge. And environment was just one of several themes that were open for public consultation last year.
So what was the outcome of the review?
Well, in relation to environment, out of 255 regulations reviewed, 70 will be continue as they are, 132 will be amended or improved, and about 53 will be scrapped.
Okay, so that sounds like quite a lot of change. What legislation is intended to be scrapped?
Well, the review isn't nearly as radical as it sounds. Most of the regulations being scrapped are already obsolete, and probably the most significant proposal is to revoke the Site Waste Management Plans regulations from 2008.
So what is a site waste management plan?
Site waste management plans are required in England for all construction projects over £300,000.
Okay.
They must be in place before the work commences, and they generally deal with the types of waste generated at the site and how it should be managed and disposed of.
So why are they being scrapped?
Well, according to DEFRA's report, the regulations have been largely ineffective. There have been no prosecutions, and generally enforcement has been poor. The government sees landfill tax as the main driver for proper construction waste management.
So surely most businesses will support their proposal, so why is it controversial?
Yes, I would imagine most businesses will actually support the change because it will reduce their time and costs. However, some industry bodies have been concerned that it's a backward step. For example, Constructing Excellence, a cross-sector member-led body, is really concerned that the proposals will be a disincentive for compliance with anything to do with waste management. According to their statistics, around a third of construction waste has been reduced since the regulations commenced, and they're not at all convinced that in the current economic climate businesses will continue to prepare these plans without the mandatory requirement.
Okay, thanks. So finally, a number of new regulations are due to commence on the 6th of April 2012. Can you just talk us through some of the key highlights, perhaps starting with the contaminated land regime?
Yes, the definition of contaminated land is being amended in relation to pollution of controlled waters, and the long-awaited revised statutory guidance on contaminated land is due to come into force on or after 6th of April. That's probably the main change. There are several other regulations, including changes to the controlled waste regulations and the control of asbestos regulations, and some minor amendments to environmental permitting. The most important of which, really, for practitioners, is that the process for transferring environmental permits is expected to change and intended to be simpler.
Okay, thanks Hayley. You've heard some key highlights from property and environment law this month. If you'd like to see more legal updates in property and environment law, then just subscribe to LexisPSL Property or LexisPSL Environment, where you can see updates such as the Bar Biffa nuisance case and the Supreme Court ruling on feed-in tariffs. If you'd like a copy of today's discussions, then just fill out the form on our website and we'll email it to you. Thanks for watching.